All right, greetings YouTube. It is Farmer Ross here at Misty Moon Farms, and today's video is going to be going over tomatoes. Tomatoes are the most prized garden vegetable that I think a lot of people want to grow, and they actually do require some amount of knowledge and skill to be able to grow them. Unlike mint and rosemary and okra, the easier things to grow, tomatoes do take a bit of know-how to know what you're doing to get the best yield depending on where you're growing. There's a lot of different varieties. So in today's video, it's going to be a little bit longer, and we're going to be going over all the information you want to know about tomatoes. So the first thing to know about tomatoes are the varieties. So there's three main different sizes of tomatoes. There's cherry tomatoes, saladette tomatoes, which is like 2 to 3 inches in diameters, and then you have larger beefsteak tomatoes, which are anywhere from 3+ inches in diameter. They're not that big, but they can get pretty big. You also have hybrid tomatoes, and then you have heirloom tomatoes. So just like dogs that were domesticated from wolves, tomatoes and pretty much all vegetables have been selectively bred to do what we want them to do, and those are called hybrid tomatoes. Heirloom tomatoes are something that's much more naturally growing. So they're seeds from hundreds of years ago, before humans started intervening and selectively breeding them. So that's what the difference between an heirloom and a hybrid is, and that's also the three different types of tomatoes size-wise. You also have determinate tomatoes and you have indeterminate tomatoes. So determinate tomatoes are going to grow for a certain amount of time, then they're going to stop. Indeterminate tomatoes will continue to grow as long as the conditions are permitting for them to grow, i.e. temperature, the nutrients are there, they don't get swallowed and attacked by bugs. And so you want to grow them different ways, and you want to consider which one you want to grow. So determinates can be really good for in North Texas, because we get so hot during the summer. It's more efficient to do 2 different tomato plantings. So if you live somewhere in the south where it gets super duper hot, you may want to consider growing determinate tomatoes. One planting in the spring, seed them anywhere from Christmas to Valentine's Day. You can get them growing inside in cells. We made videos on transplants before, but you can get those started very, very early inside of your house with just a fluorescent bulb. And so that way, when March, April comes around, you're ready to move them outside or into your greenhouse after the last frost, and you have some nice, healthy transplants ready to take off. Also in the transplant video, I talked about the dangers of getting tomato plants from the nursery. So things that you go to Home Depot, Lowe's, Callaway's, your local nursery, from Burpees or whatever, a lot of those are very diseased, and they're also already stunted. So even though they have impressive top growth and it looks like, oh, I can just buy this tomato plant and it's going to produce tomatoes, it even is flowering, it even has little tomatoes on there already, I can't mess this up. It is a big trap, because their roots are already stunted and they're probably diseased. When you get them home, you're going to have all sorts of problems. So I don't recommend falling for that trap. Seed them. No matter where you are, seed them in Christmas, anywhere from Christmas to Valentine's Day, indoors in your cells. Watch the transplanting video if you want to learn more about specifically how to transplant. And then the determinates are going to produce for 4 to 6 weeks, basically. You can milk a little bit more out of them, but they're only going to produce for that certain amount of time, and then they're going to stop producing. It's like I don't really know what to compare it to, but it's a limited time frame. And then if you grow somewhere or if you're growing somewhere north, like Colorado or above, I don't know all my zones. I'm in 7A or 7B down here. So if you're starting to get cooler than that and your summers aren't reaching 100 degrees, then you want to probably grow indeterminate tomatoes, which means that the tomato plants are just going to continue to grow throughout the summer. So you plant them at the same time, move them outside after your last frost, or plant them in your greenhouse after the last frost, let them grow all the way through the summer, and they'll produce up until October, November, depending on your weather conditions. They like it anywhere from 55 degrees Fahrenheit on the low end all the way up to 95 degrees on the high end. That's what it is required for them to fruit, for them to set flowers. So as tomatoes grow, we have a whole row here, and I'll give you a little tour on how to prune them too. They set flowers, which are like those yellow looking flowers on there, and that is what gets pollinated and eventually what turns into a tomato. So they need to be between 55 and 95 for them to make flowers and then have them called set. They get pollinated and they're going to produce tomatoes. If it's outside of those temperature ranges, the plants can continue to grow, but they're not going to produce fruits. So they want full sun. They like it very, very sunny. If you put them in shade cloth during the summer, then they're probably still going to produce if it is the middle of summer, because there's so much daylight anyways. And pruning is another big part. So if you're a home gardener growing in your backyard, if you're growing an indeterminate tomato, you may not need to prune them, which is a big advantage, I think, because if you're growing hundreds or thousands of tomatoes plants like me, pruning them is a very daunting task because you have to do it once every week, once every other week. Whereas if you have determinates, I still prune them once, but if you're a home gardener, you wouldn't need to prune them at all. And I'll show you how to prune them in just a minute. But that's one of the advantages, considering which ones you're doing and how much time you want to invest and things like that. So yeah, that's the basics of tomatoes, the different varieties, the sizes, hybrid versus heirloom, and then the determinate versus indeterminate, and why you might want to grow different ones. Cherries are a bit more hardy, so they have a bit wider of a fluctuation range. They're a little bit easier to produce. I don't know if that's because they're smaller or if that's because it takes less time to get there. I don't really know, but I have found that cherries are more hardy than your beefsteaks. If you're a commercial grower and you want to get the most bang for your buck, I do not recommend going with heirlooms. They make hybrid tomatoes that are specifically designed for greenhouse production. They're going to give you uniform fruits. Heirlooms are very prone to cracking, and the hybrids are going to give you standardized fruit sizes and very consistent clusters, which is going to make production a lot more smooth and efficient. Tomatoes also have different pest problems. So there are 3 main pests that I'm going to talk about that I have issues with, and I actually have examples of all of them here in the greenhouse right now. So I just made a video on how to deal with pests. It's very simple. Insecticidal soap, Impede, is the answer for me. It's been a godsend. And the 3 types of pests I'll add 4 types of pests to look out for actually are: 1, flea beetles. So when they're young, you can see here, the tomatoes behind me, these are very young. And I'll get the camera and do a zoom in. I'll just do it now. So this is what flea beetles look like. They look like really small fleas, and they leave holes like this. The tomato plants are very susceptible to them when they are young, like in this stage. I can almost expect that I'm gonna get some flea beetles in there. So you can see a little black dot there. So use the Impede, it'll get rid of them. Spider mites, which I've shown in another video. I can walk down here and find some. They're basically really, really small red mites. They just look like little, like smaller than a pinhead type bugs. And those really come on as it gets hotter. So sometimes it looks like the tomatoes are burning up prematurely, like the weather's getting too hot for them and they're starting to look very dry and yellowing. A lot of times it's not actually the heat, it's the spider mites. They're so small, they're hard to see, but if you go and inspect the leaves and you see little reddish, brown, orange mites on them, those are spider mites. There's some webbing and it's very distinct. So if your tomatoes look like that, dried up, yellowing leaves, probably spider mites more than the heat actually. And so, because the tomato plants will continue to grow even if it gets hot, they're just not going to set flowers and produce. So we've gone over flea beetles, spider mites, mildew, fungus is another really common problem. That can be taken care of with the copper solution, like a copper sulfate. I don't remember the name of the brand that we use, but if you just Google copper for fungus, you'll find something online. You can spray them for that if you have like a powdery mildew situation going on or a fungus going on. You also have blossom end rot. So blossom end rot is where your tomatoes will set. They're looking nice and juicy, and then the very tip of them starts to turn like brown, black, moldy, and it looks not good. And so that is called blossom end rot, and it is either from inconsistent watering or a deficiency of is it magnesium or calcium in your soil? I want to say magnesium, but there's a few different solutions for that. You can add things like gypsum. You can add things like eggshells. Just sprinkle them at the base of your plant if you're getting that blossom end rot, or bone meal. Excuse me, bone meal is what you want to use. Bone meal, and sprinkle that around the base of your plant on the soil, and then water it in, and that should fix that. And then if you've been inconsistent with watering, go ahead and get more consistent with it. And those two things will take care of the blossom end rot. The final thing that a lot of home gardeners have issues with are squirrels, raccoons, rabbits, actual mammalian creatures that are going to come and steal your tomatoes right before they're ripe. You see that they're red, you think, oh, I'm going to pick them tomorrow. And then you come back and there's a nice bite out of it, and you're like, all my hard work. So I hear that story all the time from backyard gardeners. Two solutions for that. One is insect netting. So we've gone over insect netting before. You can just cover your plants with it. And then you can also pick them early. So as soon as the tomatoes are green and they start to turn pink before they get red. So once they first get that coloration on them, you can pick them, put them inside in a dark space, and they'll continue to ripen. The gases have begun the reaction inside of that plant or inside of that fruit that are going to tell it to ripen no matter what. So if you harvest it early, let it ripen inside, that way the animals don't get to it and you are guaranteed a nice piece of tomato. So those are the two solutions for that one. And if you are growing determinate tomatoes, meaning that they have a set amount of life to them, then you can cage them. So you've all seen tomato cages before. I don't have one handy, but it's like a conical shaped metal piece of caging, and you put that around the plant, and that's what allows the plant to grow up and kind of bush out with support. Tomatoes are gonna need support. So we have a nice trellis system here. You can see these guys come down, and I can spread them out on this wire. And then there's one piece of, this is baling wire, it works really great. And so as they come up, we'll just take them and twist them around the baling wire, so they'll grow up around it, and then we'll have really walls of tomatoes. So it looks pretty nice, and they're very easy to prune that way, and it's also going to keep airflow in them. So if you don't trellis your tomatoes, which I don't recommend doing, I recommend trellising them in some way. If it's a cage or a system like this, then it's going to create airflow through your plants, which is going to help with the fungal problems that I talked about and kind of slow down the infestation of insects if you have. All right, and we're back. So the phone died, or the phone ran out of storage, so we had to resume. We were talking about airflow and trellising and the importance of trellising. Basically, I always recommend trellising no matter what you're growing, determinate or indeterminate. And if you're gonna grow indeterminate, I recommend something where it can trellis for a long time, whereas determinates are the only times that you really want to use those tomato cages. And we're gonna look at pruning now. So hopefully I have one that's large enough to show you what a sucker is. Here's some bigger ones. All right. So you can see some flea beetles here, which I just warned you about. So here's the main stem, right? And then here is a normal looking leaf. And then from the where those two meet, there's going to be this thing that wants to grow out that looks like this. Those are called suckers. So you look at the main stem here, then you look at the side leaf, and then the thing growing out at the 45 is called a sucker. This is a very, very small one. It'll grow to be like an actual branch if I gave it enough time, but these are still kind of young. Let's see if we can look at this one. This one's decent here, okay? So main stem, side branch, thing growing up at the 45. It looks like there's new growth to it. That's an easy way to determine it, and you just pinch it off. So you could also Google, just what a tomato sucker is, but it's basically the main stem, and then horizontal, perpendicular to that is the actual leaf, and then growing 45 between those two is what's called a sucker. That's what you want to cut. If they're small enough, you can pinch them off, or you can use some sort of sharp instrument to cut them. And if you're doing the determinates, if anything, you only need to do that once. You don't even have to do it. And then if you're growing indeterminates, you're gonna need to do that every 1 to 2 weeks. Food-wise, tomatoes need a lot of food. So you've seen my videos on soil building. If you're doing regular maintenance for your soil with the compost and I use biosol, or if you're using whatever nutrients you're adding organically, should be plenty fine. And yeah, so I don't deal with the NPK stuff. I talked about that till the cows come home. But just maintain your soil, and the tomato plants are going to be fine. With the only exception is the possibility of needing to add bone meal if you're getting a lot of blossom end rot and you're not able to keep your water consistent. You could use some bone meal in there. What else? We talked about types of tomatoes. We talked about pests. We talked about nutrition. We talked about pruning. We talked about harvesting, how to deal with all the different pests. So that's my comprehensive guide to everything you need to know about tomatoes. So if you're more on the beginner side, I recommend something smaller, maybe a nice cherry tomato, like a Super Cherry 100, just a classic cherry tomato, or a hybrid beefsteak or saladette tomato. And then if you're wanting to be a bit more exotic, you could grow some type of heirloom tomato, knowing that your yield isn't going to be as big, and the problems or the likelihood of problems is going to be higher. So start off with something very basic and have fun with it. If you have any questions, feel free to comment down below. Reach out to me. I'm happy to answer them, and maybe make a video on tomatoes part 2 or something. So thank you. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and many blessings. Ciao.